patience for a few moments there. Quite a big turnout tonight. I'm very happy to welcome everybody to the Department of Social Science and Cultural Studies speaker series tonight. Tonight we're pleased and honored to welcome David Harvey, who's the distinguished professor of anthropology and geography at the CUNY Grad Center, to discuss his work and his many insights into many issues, including, of course, the contradictions of capital and the social relations of capital today. Professor Harvey's work on cities and space, the problems of modernity, social change, and Marxist theory have influenced and engaged scholars and activists across many fields. And his work has always been in the great tradition of geographical inquiry that unites the study of the earth with the relation of humans and nature with the revolutionary critique of social injustice. Professor Harvey's many works include several landmarks, in fact, such as Explanation in Geography, Social Justice in the City, The Condition of Postmodernity, Cosmopolitanism, and the Geographies of Freedom and Justice, and Justice, Nature, and the Geography of Difference. Professor Harvey also presents a notable and accessible 22-part open course lecture series entitled Reading Marx's Capital of David Harvey, which I greatly suggest because my own students have to watch it for their own classes. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Harvey to speak to us.
Yeah, some of you will gather from that. In recent times I've been very interested in the whole kind of question of how to make Marx more readily understood to a wider audience. I have a lot of colleagues who seem to delight in making Marx more complicated than he already is, which means that it's pretty inaccessible to almost anybody to understand what the hell's going on. But as part of that project, which is just about Marx, I'm also interested in trying to extract from the sorts of simplifications that I tried to construct understandings of contemporary events, and beyond that also to try to construct some sense of what an anti-capitalist politics might be about. Capitalism as a social system has been around for 250 years, longer if you want to push it back. But it seems to me that the idea that this form of social system can survive until infinity is pretty far-fetched. In my own view, it's reached an inflection point, which is not the same as an impasse. It's an inflection point where actually we really do have to start to think about alternatives, alternative ways of organizing production, consumption, distribution, as well as reorganizing our social relations, our political institutions. But what strikes me as odd right now is it's, with all the resources we have available to start to think freely about alternatives, there's very little thinking going on. There are some practices emerging in many of the social movements around the world who are trying to extract themselves, if you like, from the grips of this system. But it's hardly as if there are massive movements going on inside of universities to try to think alternatives. It's just not going on. Basically, people go to universities to receive the orthodoxy. Having received the orthodoxy, they then go work to the orthodoxy, and that's it. So I'm interested in those topics. Now, the topic I'm going to address today is the idea of contradiction, which For anybody who's read Marx, you'll know that this is cropping up all the time. And it's particularly pertinent because whenever Marx talks about crises and crisis formation, he nearly always talks about it in terms of certain contradictions which get heightened into an absolute contradiction which breaks out in the form of a crisis. So, to the degree that we have been through something that we might call a crisis over the last 7 or 8 years, it would seem very relevant to ask the question, what are the contradictions that lie behind this crisis? But there's another reason why I think dwelling on the notion of contradiction is important. My Marxist colleagues, and I'll include myself in this, have the awful habit of when there's something we cannot understand and we cannot explain, we just put our hands up and say, oh well, it's the contradictions of capitalism. End of story. And it's sort of a cheap way out. Kind of say, I don't understand what the hell's going on here. So I want to get out of that by actually trying to configure a little bit what the nature of many of the contradictions are, and to try to pin together an account of the contradictions of capital. Now, I want to make clear that I'm going to be talking about the contradictions of capital and not the contradictions of capitalism. And the reason I make that distinction is because there are many more contradictions within capitalism than there are within capital. Capitalism is a very complicated kind of system. It has a very complex history. That history has produced all manner of contradictions. And so when you're talking about the contradictions of capitalism, you have to deal with things like the racialization of capitalism. You have to deal with things, all sorts of aspects of gender discrimination, patriarchy, all of those kinds of questions. The idea of the contradictions of capital has a rather narrow focus. It specifically asks the question, what are the contradictions which operate internal to the process of circulation and accumulation of capital? And I annoy my colleagues somewhat who dispute me on this, but I say things like, well, to understand the contradictions of capital, I don't have to understand how everything gets racialized or everything gets gendered. I have a very much narrower kind of thing. I'm looking at the economic engine, if you like, which sits at the center of capitalism in order to look at its contradictions and, of course, the implications those contradictions have for capitalism in general. I spent a lot of time, sort of reading Marx's texts and been sort of fiddling around with this question of contradictions for the last 2 or 3 years. And at this point in time, I've reached the following count that there are 17 major contradictions of capital. And since you're going to want me to talk about each contradiction for 20 minutes, you can figure out how long you're going to be here to get through this whole thing. So obviously I'm not going to deal with all 17 contradictions. I decided to divide the contradictions into 3 broad categories. The first category of 7 contradictions is what I would call the category of foundational contradictions, fundamental contradictions. The second category are contradictions which are what I call manageable contradictions, to some degree derivative. Obviously, the foundational contradiction would be the class relation between capital and labour. That's always there. That class relation is foundational for understanding capital accumulation. So that's foundational. A managerial contradiction which would parallel that would be the distribution of income and wealth in society. That is, you would expect a society that's class divided to be characterized by inequality, but how much inequality can be managed one way or the other? And there have been certain historic periods and places where a relatively egalitarian capitalism has emerged, and certain times and places like our own where enormous and astonishing inequality has emerged. I don't see astonishing and enormous inequality as absolutely necessary to the perpetuation of a capitalist system. There's no reason why we could not, at this point in history, turn around and say, let's have a much more egalitarian form of capitalism. So it's a managed contradiction, but it's a contradiction that can get heightened into an absolute contradiction and be the center of a crisis. So that's why I still think it's very important to include it among the contradictions of capital. So there are 7 foundational, 7 manageable or derivative, and then there are 3 contradictions that are fatal. When you say fatal, people kind of say, wow, okay, what are they? And I'm not going to talk about them, but I will mention what they are. And you can imagine roughly what they are. The first is sort of on the edge of fatal and manageable. And that's really the metabolic relation with nature. Throughout the history of capitalism, people have again and again predicted that capital would end because of natural scarcity or natural forces and the incompatibility of capital accumulation or extraction of infinite resources. Historically, that's never really happened. But because it's never really happened, it doesn't mean it can't happen. And that gets back to this idea of, are we at an inflection point in our metabolic relation to nature where the stresses in relation to evolutionary processes, natural environment and all the rest of it have reached a point where actually this could potentially be fatal. So it's potentially fatal. The second fatal contradiction is compound growth. And it's very weird. Hardly anybody ever understands what compound growth is. The famous way of understanding it is the story of the person who kind of invented chess, and like, you know, the emperor or whoever it was kind of wanted to give him a reward. He said, well, very simple, put 1 grain of rice on square 1, and then double the number on each other square, and then I'll take what you give me. And the emperor thought this was a reasonable deal, so went to that. The trouble was, when I got halfway through, all the rice in the whole kingdom was gone. And if you get to the end, you're pretty much in a universe of rice. I mean, it's a logistical curve. It goes like this, and it gets bigger, very rapid. Now, capitalism has been expanding at a compound rate of about 2.25% per year since around 1780 or 1820 or whatever. And the big question is, can that compounding, and the compound rate curves are very interesting. They go like this, and then they go like this, and then they go like this. Are we at that inflection point where actually the compounding is getting serious? I calculated that to keep compound rate going in 1970, you'd have to find profitable investment opportunities globally for something like $0.74 trillion. Now, if you want to get 3% compound growth, you're going to have to find profitable investment opportunities for $1.5 trillion. By the time you get to 2030, it's going to be $30 trillion. And then it's going to be 60, and then it's going to be 120, and then it's going to be, in other words, you're on a compound rate, you're on a compound path, and compound rates cannot go on forever. In fact, there's a wonderful story about compound interest. And for those of you who are literary buffs, this is the story that lies behind the famous Chancery court case in Bleak House, John Dice versus John Dice. Somebody made a will in 1794 or something like that, and had £600,000 and said, nobody can touch this money for 100 years. It shall be invested at 6% compound interest. And when somebody did some calculations, they realized that by the end of 100 years, there would be more money in this trust than there would be in the total output of the British economy. So a big court case took place. The family sued because they couldn't get the money because nobody could touch it for 100 years, and they were mad as hell because they wanted to get their hands on the 600,000 obviously. The big court case went on, and it went on for something like 50 years. And eventually, the court case was settled. But by then, the legal fees were so great that there was absolutely no money left in the trust. But anyway, this is compound growth. And I think that compound growth is the second big threat. The third threat is what I call universal alienation, which is at some point is about how many people are fed up with the kind of living in the kind of world they're living in. And there are a lot of indications that a lot of people are. And when you hit the situation as we do now, where there are no reasonable jobs anywhere, no meaningful jobs anymore, even if there are jobs, there's a big question mark right now whether it's better to be employed or unemployed. Where prospects of the future are kind of pretty miserable all around, except for a very privileged few. And all kinds of things seem to be going wrong, including relation to nature and all the rest of it. And all kinds of pathologies are emerging, and sub-pathologies, and semi-criminalities, and all the rest of it. And capital is no longer necessarily behaving in an ethical way, but it's engaging in a great deal of predatory practices and downright robbery and thievery and all the rest of it. So at some point or other, people may just get fed up and revolt. And I can't see people sitting around taking this forever. So that's the general structure. But I thought, just to give you an idea of what this is about, I'd talk a little bit about the foundational contradictions and try to indicate the way in which I see them, both helping to explain but also setting a political project. The first contradiction you find on page 1 of Capital is a contradiction between use value and exchange value within the commodity. Commodity has a use value and has exchange value. I use the example of a house. What's the use value of a house? Well, it's shelter, it's a place where affective relations can flourish, where privacy is guaranteed. You can list all sorts of use values for a house. And fundamentally, we want to have a house because of the use values in it. Okay. But of course, the house also has an exchange value, and we have to lay out on a house of exchange value to get it now. Initially, the exchange value content was very small. If you were a frontiersman, and you're out there on the frontier, you'd build your own house with raw materials coming around. Neighbors might help you put the roof on, and labor would be all done by you, and the exchange value content of the house would be very small. It would be, nails and saws and axes and things like that, which you would have to purchase, but the amount of exchange value involved, hardly anything. So effectively, the housing was produced as a use value, and the exchange value content was very small. Then, around the 17th and 18th century, new systems of housing production came into being, which was speculative housing production. People would start to build large areas of housing and then sell them as commodities. And you can see this in the Georgian terraces of Britain and so on, first being done to the upper income people, and then of course, back-to-back housing and terrace housing in industrial cities was produced in this way as well. So it's speculative housing in which somebody builds the house as a commodity and then sells it. Either sells it to somebody who rents it or sells it to somebody who purchases it. So the exchange value starts to come into the picture. About 100 years ago, but particularly since the 1930s, the idea took hold that the exchange value of the house was not only important for the person who built it, but also for the person who lived in it. And there came therefore a push for home ownership. And in order to get home ownership, you had to get a mortgage, but at the end of the mortgage, you owned the house. And this was a way of building a savings for yourself. So even working class people were encouraged to try to become homeowners, and they could build asset values to themselves. So the house became a form of saving. And that became important. And it became so important that it started to affect very much the forms of social life. For example, you became very concerned not only about the use value of your house, but about the exchange value. And so if the wrong people moved in down the street, you'd say, my housing value is going to go down. And you started to say, keep those people out. And so you start to find racial discrimination and all sorts of other discriminations occurring in housing markets, and homeowners started to form associations to keep out anything they didn't want, and all that kind of stuff. So something built around the exchange value, which was very, very powerful. And then about 30 odd years ago, people discovered another use for it. I mean, it had been there all along, but this became massive about 30 years ago. That is, the house became an instrument for speculation. I didn't even care necessarily about the use value of the house. I got the house because I got a very dirt cheap mortgage and I had no credit, and I got this house for $300,000, and I flipped it and sold it 3 years later for $400,000. I made out $100,000 out of it. I speculated on it. And so speculation on the house picks up. Okay? So what you see is a long history about housing of the use value being diminished and the exchange value side of it becoming more and more and more significant until 2008, when the whole housing thing blows up. Then what happens? About 6 million people get foreclosed. 6 million people lose their use values because of this exchange value stuff. And the same thing applied, by the way, even before this is going on. Housing prices are going up so far and so fast that many people can't get access to housing. So we moved from a world in which the exchange value was minuscule to the world where the exchange value was pushing everything. And this, of course, occurred in an environment in which we were being told again and again and again that the best and most efficient way to gain the use values you need is to let the exchange value system run. It was said about education, it was said about healthcare, it was said about everything else. Now, what kind of world do you want to live in? This is the political point. You want to live in a world where everybody has access to a decent use value? Or do you want to live in a world where people are engaging in a rat race over exchange value, with many people excluded from a decent use value? Look what's happened to education. My education, you can tell this to people say you must have been living on planet Mars, was free right the way through to the PhD. It was a free good. Now, of course, it's charged for. And it gets more and more and more expensive, and you have to lay out, student debt and all that kind of stuff. In other words, the exchange value component has become stronger and stronger and stronger. And I would argue that an anti-capitalist politics would be one in which we would want to emphasize use values, not exchange values. And we want to maximize the flow of good, solid use values to the mass of the population, no matter what the exchange value issues are. This is what I mean about connecting the idea of contradiction with an explanation of a crisis and also a political leader. But there's something interesting about exchange value, which brings me to the second contradiction. How do you measure exchange value? What do you measure it in? You measure it in money. Now, it's very interesting. Ask people what is money, and nobody can give you a coherent answer. It's there all the time. Well, my answer is that money is a representation of social labour. And it's a material representation of social relation, which is the social labour that others do for us. And money is simply a measure of that social labour, which is incorporated in the things and the services and all the rest of it. Now, it's interesting at this point to go to an idea about representation. Representations and symbols of things are very good at communicating certain information, but they nearly always do it by excluding other information. Being a geographer, I always use the example of a map. A map is really very good at representing the terrain and all this kind of stuff in certain ways, but at the same time, maps lie. They don't tell you everything you need to know. And they miss out things. And the same is true with money. Now, one of the peculiar things that happens with money is that actually the representation, i.e. money, is in contradiction to that which it represents. And it's in contradiction for a very, very simple reason, that the sociality is turned into a thing which is appropriable by private persons. So here you have money, which is the store of wealth, and it is socially produced. That wealth is socially produced. And then it's appropriated by individuals who can stack up that money and use it as a form of social power. And they can use it as a form of social power to dominate. They can use it to dominate elections, dominate the media. What kind of world do we live in right now? We live in a world which is dominated by the tremendous appropriation of social wealth by private individuals, which says that there's something wrong with the money system. There's something weird about the money system. And that contradiction comes to the fore when it is, if you like, the erroneous side of money, which becomes more and more emphatic in the way in which our society gets organized. Marx has this wonderful thing, he said, well, you know, once you get the money form, then you can buy anything. You can buy conscience, honor, elections, anything you like, as soon as you've got money power. But that is not what the sociality should have been about, or was ever designed for. So this contradiction becomes absolutely critical for understanding certain features of our society. Now, monetary forms have, of course, evolved, and you know, I don't have to go through all this stuff about, you know, derivatives and all the rest of it, but there's a very interesting way in which money becomes what Marx called fictitious capital. That is, there is an assumption that something is being produced even though the box is empty. And if you assume it is being produced and you can persuade others that it's being produced, then you can actually trade it, the empty box, as if it is full of something. And this is what happened with the collateralized debt obligations. There was an empty box full of these kind of things, and it was really worth nothing. But you persuaded people this is a form of fictitious capital. Now notice what happened. I mentioned the housing market crash. Look at the role of fictitious capital, look at the role of speculative activity, look at the way in which money power was being utilized in housing markets in nefarious ways, actually, so that this group could rob that group. So this contradiction between money and what it represents locks into the exchange value, use value contradiction to give you some idea of what was going on in that housing crisis. And of course we know that the impacts, and this is where I get down to what happened within capitalism, the impacts were highly racialized. We know that those people who lost their asset values were essentially African Americans and Hispanics, and there was also a very strong gender component. We know that the asset values of African Americans were diminished by something like close to 70%. 70% of asset values were lost in Hispanic populations. We don't have a measure on what happened to women, but we certainly know in the African American case, it was single-headed households that were most severely hit. So the impacts are racialized and the rest of it, but it's the impact. You can't explain what happened by the racialization. You can explain the pattern of impacts, but you can't explain, if you like, the dynamic of what happened between use value and exchange value and money and what it was representing, and those contradictions and how those contradictions got out of whack. Now, this is the interesting thing here. I've suggested that the first contradiction between use value and exchange value locks into the second. Both of them lock into the third, which is the relationship between private property and the state. You can't have exchange value without having agents who have full ownership rights over the commodity they trade. Therefore, there has to be a system of private property for exchange value to work. Private property, however, requires that there be a juridical order, a system of law, a system of contract, and a coercive apparatus to ensure the rights of private property are upheld, which means that you need the state, or something like a state. And out of this comes a contradiction between the individual and private property and the state, a perpetual contradiction between the two. They both need each other, they can't do without each other. And what's interesting, however, is when you look at from where the state derives its power. The state typically is always described as that institution that has a monopoly over the means of violence. That monopoly over the means of violence is typically used to protect private property and protect capital. But the state also has something else, which is very, very, very vital. And that's a monopoly over the money supply and over the currency. Which explains why it is that it is a felony to try and set up an alternative currency to the dollar. If you and I all decided that we would sit down and say, I don't like the dollar, let's use something else, we could all go to jail. Very, very, very interesting. I mean, there was a guy, an artist guy, who made fake dollars. It was clear they were fake, but they were so fake that they were almost perfect as dollars. And he actually took them places and said, this is an art object, and he started exchanging them for goods. And he got arrested by the FBI and is now waiting a prison sentence for violating the integrity of the currency. And this has been crucial to the whole history of capitalism. Way, way back, the integrity of the currency was crucial. At that time, there was a problem of what were called clipped coins. That is, you'd have a silver coin, and what you do is you take a silver coin and you just file a little silver off it, and you took all the silver coins and filed silver off each coin, you soon had a silver coin. And people were making money by clipping the currency. Which explains, by the way, why currency has its serrated edges. And it's very interesting that at that time, this was a capital offence, and you could be hung for clipping the currency. And guess who was made Master of the King's Mint in Britain to make sure that there was no clipping of the currency going on? It was none other than Sir Isaac Newton. And Sir Isaac had a good time sending many people to be hung on Tyburn gallows. He was a very nice man. For clipping the currency. So the integrity of the currency and the power of the state becomes significant. Now, if I put the state and money together, this then leads into a very interesting kind of political understanding, a political history, which I think many people on the left don't get, which is what some of the people on the libertarian right are saying. The story on the libertarian right goes something like this. That once upon a time there was a genuine possibility of bourgeois democracy. That possibility of bourgeois democracy rested upon the idea that individuals had the right to issue their own currency. That right was denied around the time of John Locke, Newton and all the rest of it, and was finally fully denied in the British case in 1694 or something like that, when something called the Bank of England was formed. And the Bank of England had an interesting situation. The state was fighting wars and it needed money to fight the wars. It needed to borrow money. They went to the merchants in London and said, lend us the money to fight the wars. And the merchant said, okay, we'll lend you the money provided you give us a monopoly over the issuing of the currency. So we will then, you and I, the state and big capital, will control the issuing of the currency. And that was the formation of the Bank of England. There was a big struggle in this country, and those of you know your American history know about greenbacks and those kinds of things. Big struggle in this country, and this was only settled with the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. But what we've got here is the state then relating to money in a certain kind of way. And that state relationship to the money had a very, very important role to play, of course, in the way in which the Federal Reserve managed interest rates in the run-up to the crash of 2008. Had also a very important role in the way in which the state encouraged home ownership, in fact promoted home ownership like crazy for political and also economic reasons. So suddenly you see that many of those elements that fed into that housing crash are connected to all of the way these contradictions are embedded within the capitalist logic of capital accumulation. And when you look at this, you suddenly then ask yourself the question, well, what would be the political alternative? What would we do if we democratized money and the control over money? Very interesting question as to how you would do it and what kind of money you would want to create. Now, money has a number of different functions. One of its functions is to act as a medium of circulation. That is, it's a sort of it lubricates the whole kind of exchange of goods. And in that role as a lubricator of exchange of goods, it's fairly neutral. I mean, not entirely so, but it's fairly neutral. Money is also a measure of value, and there it's not so neutral. But its big non-neutrality is the way in which it stores value. Now, the reason gold and silver became the money commodities was because they had certain physical properties that were terribly important. And the physical property that was absolutely crucial was that they're not oxidizable. These metals don't rust. A gold piece is exactly the same now as it was 100, 200 years ago. It maintains its qualities and shape and everything else for a very, very, very long time. I mean, if money was raspberries, just think what a mess. So you can understand why, the decision was to take gold and silver, because they maintained everything constant over time. Well, we're now in a situation where, of course, money has become electronic. So it maintains its number. But you could, if you wanted, create a money that is oxidizable as opposed to non-oxidizable. That is, you could create a money that would disappear if you didn't use it. It's an anti-accumulation money. Wouldn't that be great? And actually, people have experimented with this in the 1930s. There were things called stamped monies. The idea of this was, if you had the equivalent of, say, a $100 bill, it was only valid for a month. And if you didn't spend it, then you had to get it renewed. And you had to go and get a stamp on it to get the $100 renewed, but you had to pay $5 to get it renewed. That means there's a tax on wealth. Now imagine what George Soros or one of those people would have to do is they would trot into the post office with all their dollar bills and get a stamp, pay $5 for every $5. And pretty soon all that wealth would disappear, right? So you want money that disappears. You want oxidizable money. I think this is a great idea. I mean, some people down in Argentina are experimenting with this, by the way. So they've invented a sort of a coupon system and a barter network in which if you don't use it, you lose it. So you want to experiment with entirely different monetary forms. I think you'll probably always need something like money to lubricate exchange, but measuring value, who really cares about that? You only care about that if you're interested in competitive markets and all the rest of it. I don't think it matters so much. And certainly you want to prevent, if you can, accumulation of social wealth in private hands. And one of the ways to do it is completely reconfigure what the monetary system is about, in particular to create an oxidizable form of currency. What would you do about private property in the state? Well, a lot of people on the left right now are talking about common property. And I think actually the common property rights is a very good way to go. That is, you would merge private property and the state into a common property regime, in which then the only interesting question would be who manages the common property. Because common property is never kind of just out there and anybody uses it. It's got to be managed in some way or other, and there's got to be somebody responsible for things. So there would be sort of managerial structures, collective managerial structures of a common property. Housing could be a common property right. No reason why not. Why not? Be much better actually providing housing that way than the way we're doing it right now. And in fact, there are legal forms around right now, land trusts and various other forms, limited equity co-ops and so on, which are coming close to treating housing as a common property right. So you would start to have in your mind not only moving towards a society which is more based on use value and exchange value, but also moving towards a society in which control over money and the relationship between money and sociality is reformed and refigured in such a way that you cannot get this distortion which arises out of the private appropriation of social wealth. And then also talk about the reform of the state apparatus and put into a new configuration which is around common property rights rather than about private property and accumulation of wealth and power. Now, I've just mentioned three of the first sort of contradictions. I'm going to jump around a little bit and talk about a couple of others. One of the others, which I think is very important to me, is what Marx calls the contradictory unity between production and realization. This is, for me, a very, very important idea. And it's become more important to me as I worked on the lectures for Volume 2 of Capital. And I've just finished the written version, a companion to Volume 2 of Capital. And what you find is, in Volume 1 of Capital, Marx is talking about production. He's talking about the production of surplus value, the production of profit. And this is but he holds all sorts of other things constant. So in Volume 1, there's never any problem of finding a market. The issue of the market is not discussed. I mean, it's mentioned, but, just assumed away. So it's about production as if there was absolutely no problem in the market. And we learn from this about the dilemmas of production and the consequences of the way production must be organized to complete its mission. And one of the conclusions Marx comes to towards the end of Volume 1 is that when we look at the logic of the production of surplus value, what we see is a society which can be characterized by the rich growing inevitably richer and richer, and the poor growing poorer and poorer. As he puts it, accumulation of wealth at one pole, accumulation of poverty, misery, degradation at the other pole, on the part of those who produce the wealth. So this is, if you like, the conclusion that follows from the analysis of Volume 1. But Volume 1 is a model of production as if there is no problem of realization, as if there is no problem in the market. Volume 2 assumes there's absolutely no problem in production. But there is a problem in the market. There's a problem of realization. It analyzes all of the dynamics of realization. How is the product circulated in such a way? Where is the market? And Marx immediately points to one obvious contradiction, that if the dynamic of capital is making the working class poorer and poorer and poorer and poorer, who the hell is going to buy the product? Now, clearly the working class can never buy all of the product, and clearly there are other forces involved in buying the product, other groups in the population, but to diminish, systematically diminish aggregate demand on the part of the working class is to actually seriously threaten the stability of the system. And so by the time you get to the end of volume 2 of Capital, you find Marx talking about various ways in which the bourgeoisie becomes concerned to manage working class consumption so that it becomes what he calls a rational consumption, rational from the standpoint of capital accumulation. Now, one of the ways in which rational consumption was foisted upon working classes of Europe and North America from the 1930s onwards was precisely on housing and home ownership. This became, if you like, a form of rational consumption which absorbed vast amounts of capitalist product and vast amounts of capitalist activity, and at the same time was forming a market. Now, the market had to be there, so how was the market created? Well, you had to pay workers more so they could buy houses. And the famous example of this was Henry Ford, who created the $5 8-hour day. And when he was sort of asked why he was doing that, he said basically we need a working class that is able to buy the products we create. But we have to make sure that those workers actually consume correctly. So actually he formed the Russell Sage Foundation and all of those social workers who went into workers' houses to make sure the workers didn't spend it all on booze and drink and women and all kinds of things like that. They actually spent it on rationally on consumer goods. So this whole kind of question of rational working class consumption comes into the picture in Volume 2 in ways which is unthinkable in Volume 1. Now, historically, I'd argue something broad, in very, very broad terms, and it's a very crude generalization, that from 1945 to around the mid-1970s, public policy was dominated by Volume 2 thinking. That is, manage the demand, and then production will look after itself. So we had, as it were, increasing purchasing power on the part of many segments of the working class with strong unions and all the rest of it. And that was the way in which society worked. But what was happening in the 1960s, it became evident, was working class was becoming too strong and there were serious problems emerging in production. That is, you were doing well in terms of the Volume 2 analysis, but you were doing badly in terms of the Volume 1 analysis. And eventually you had the crisis of the 1970s, which reversed it all and kind of said, to hell with this, let's crush the working class and let's reduce their consumer capacities and powers. Let's do that. And then we'll be all right on the Volume 1 analysis. And since 1975 or so, that is in fact what's happened with wonderful pedagogic effects, because I could, by the time you get to the 1990s, I could take accounts in the New York Times of sweatshop labor in Indonesia and put it in Marx's chapter on the working day and say, tell me what the difference is. And there was no difference. It was you're right back to exactly what Marx was talking about in the 1850s, 1860s in Britain, which was not the case at the end of the 1960s and 1970s. So you're back in the Volume 1 territory. So Volume 1 suddenly reads like it's a perfect analysis of what the hell's going on under capitalism right now.
which it didn't read like when I first started teaching in the 1970s. Volume 2, if I'd been reading Volume 2 in the 1970s, which I wasn't, if I'd been reading it, I would have said, well, actually, this is the one that tells you what's going on. So you have a dilemma there, that you do okay in the realm of production and you screw up in the world of consumption. Or you do well in the world of consumption and you screw up in the world of production. And society swings from one to the other. And even more interestingly, what we then see is various disguises through which this contradiction gets mediated. One of the disguises is, of course, the creation of fictitious capital and the creation of credit. That is, you compensate for the lack of real incomes on the part of workers by actually feeding them credit cards and all of that, and getting them to run up huge debts. So that you cover over the lack of consumer power by actually issuing credit. Well, you can do that for a number of years. But we saw that beginning to come unstuck towards the end of the 90s in the first crash of the stock market and the end of the kind of electronics boom. And then, of course, we see the switch into the housing boom and another crash. And again, a lot of that is led by fictitious capital feeding consumerism, which really wasn't there. So then there's the other interesting point, that where value is produced, Marx's argument is it's produced in production. Where value is produced and where it's realized are two different things. Let's suppose the workers struggle like crazy to get better wages, and they manage through strikes and organization and all of that and political pressure to get better wages. They take their wages home and it's in their pockets, and then what happens to it? Well, there's the landlord waiting for them, who kind of sucks out some of that which they have already won. Then all kinds of predatory practices in the consumer sector. Telephone companies are my favorite these days, and I'm sure you understand what I mean. I mean, you know, taxes go on here, and taxes go on there, and charges here, and charges there, and credit card charges, and all this kind of stuff. So the money is taken out by the landlord, it's taken out by the merchant capitalist, it's taken out by the financial capitalists. In other words, the money that was won by those struggles at the point of production gets sucked back in these other places, which means that actually class struggle is not simply about what goes on in the place of work. It's also about what's happening to those incomes and those people with incomes once they get back and they start spending it and trying to utilize the money power they have to gain the use values that they need. And this also has, I think, international implications. What's the relationship between Walmart and its direct producers? Many of them in China. Walmart can squeeze the producers so that their profit margins are almost zero. And so all of the profit ends up in Walmart's pocket, which is why Walmart is the richest family, Walton's are the richest family in the United States right now. They squeeze the producers. So again, where the profit is produced and where it's realized, two different questions. But the tension between production and realization is never done away with. And society has a very hard time dealing with that. And in many respects, you would look at the crisis as unfolded over the last year, over the last 5 years, and you'd say, this tension between production and realization came to a head. They ran out of the possibilities of realization, and it's pretty clear right now that one of the big problems is the lack of effective demand in the economy. Because the economy is being propped up in a very peculiar way, and this then takes me back to that second and third contradictions about the money and the state. Because when the Federal Reserve does something called quantitative easing, what does it do? It actually chucks out loads and loads more money into the market. Where does that go? It doesn't go to your pocket or my pocket. It doesn't actually even get out into the economy. Because basically what it does is it props up the stock market. I mean, the stock market is recovered because of quantitative easing. And in fact, what this comes back to is the idea that the state and the money system are there and have been constructed to protect an oligarchy. Not only to protect an oligarchy, but actually to promote the interests of the oligarchy. And that has been the case since the formation of the Bank of England and the Federal Reserve. That the institutional arrangements are actually tightly woven into a certain structure of class power which maintains the configuration of contradictions even to the point of being perfectly happy with their creating crises, provided the crises are worked out in a way that they end up better off, which of course they're doing. So here in New York City, the income tax returns, which, you can imagine how accurate they are, but the income tax returns showed that the average income of the top 1% of the population of New York City was $3.57 million a year. The income tax returns also showed that 50% of the population of New York City is trying to live on less than $30,000 a year. That is, the rich 1% earn in about 3 days what they earn in a year. And that is all protected by the way in which these institutional arrangements are locked together in these kind of contradictory forms. And what that says to me is, of course, one of the key things we have to do politically in terms of an anti-capitalist struggle is to, A, focus on that oligarchy, which certainly was what Occupy Wall Street began to do. Focus on that oligarchy, focus on its power, and actually diminish its power. And in particular, reconstruct the institutions in such a way that they cannot reconstitute that power. Now what I'm arguing for here, by looking at all these contradictions in this way, is not to say, okay, let's go do this next week, but to have an imagination, an imaginary, about what it is that an anti-capitalist struggle should broadly have in mind when we're looking at the specificities. So that if you have worker-controlled factories emerging in places like Argentina and Greece, they understand what their relationship is with private property, money, and all the rest of it. And they understand the relationship. That struggles over housing and the commons and all those kinds of things can be located against the background of why such struggles are important and why they should be generally supported. Why struggles over maximizing the role of use value in society and minimizing the exchange value of content are absolutely crucial. Why we should actually get away from what we're being permanently taught and preached, which is that if you go away from an exchange value structure system, you won't get any use values delivered at all. Get away from that and say, that's nonsense. There are certainly ways in which use values can be delivered and built. And we have to start to think about how to do it. So the idea here, as I said, is to try to create a very general imaginary about the sort of framework of thinking that should lie behind the specificities of any anti-capitalist struggle, wherever we happen to be. Let me leave it there. Thanks.
Some time for some questions.
Where does, when you talk about money and the democratizing money, where does local money that's happening all over the U.S. and cities, most notably Ithaca, come into play?
Yeah, they're very interesting experiments with that, and I think
first of all, it testifies to what I'm talking about, that there's a desire for an alternative monetary structure and all the rest of it. The difficulty with those systems is that they're very small. Very few of them have been sustained for that long. Some of them, if they start to get a bit big, get immediately harassed by authorities. So it's, you know. So there's interesting kind of questions attached. There are some other alternative currencies that are emerging that have broader provenance, like Bitcoin, for example, is something which is out there as an alternative currency. It's not anti-capitalist at all. In fact, it's pro-capitalist. It's pro-small entrepreneur, and it bypasses the power of banks and is anti the banking structure. It's like entrepreneurs not wanting to deal with banks. So there are systems, but it would seem to me perfectly feasible to construct a network of users using electronic monies. And I know one that's being constructed in Argentina right now called BioEcon. You can't get on it because it's still being tested, but there are ways in which you can start to do this. But I would argue that about the local economic trading systems with good dollars. Cities are starting to issue them. There's the Bristol pound, the Hackney pound. Almost everybody has their own pound now in Britain. That first off, yes, it testifies to, well, something different is needed. But secondly, almost all of those initiatives have either failed to really get hold of and jump scale, as we call it, to something much bigger, and that therefore we need to really think about what a radical reconfiguration of the monetary system might look like from a rather different perspective.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, global coordination of anti-capitalist struggle and maybe what technology's role in that has been or how that's changed.
Well, I'm not an expert on this. There's a great deal of interaction, but I have to say, I also get the sense that there's nowhere near enough of it. I mean, there were these attempts through the World Social Forum and the regional forums and so on to sort of try to bring groups together, and to some degree that did help. And there are some organizations like Via Campesina, which do have a global kind of reach. And there are other movements like the environmental justice movement, the global, which have a more global kind of coordination. I'm struck. I work a lot, of course, with cities and stuff about housing and so on. I went to a meeting just a month ago in Athens, which, for the first time, actually brought together activists on urban issues from Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece. But it was the first time it had happened. So the answer was, well, there's not that much anywhere near as much coordination as there really should be on some of these issues. There are some parts of the world where coordinations are better than others. Brazil is much more active, I think, in reaching out and coordinating through organizations like the NST and the housing rights movements and so on. But they either remain sectorally divided, so this one deals with housing, this one deals with climate, this one deals with something else, or they are just simply locally based. And so that's the organization. But the impressive thing is, if you add up all of those movements and all of those people involved in all those movements, you end up with a tremendous political base. And you never know with those sorts of things at what point it can just suddenly coalesce into something. I mean, we've seen very volatile movements suddenly erupt and then suddenly disappear.
We've just gone through the 10th anniversary of the anti-war demonstration of February the 15th, 2003, where millions of people simultaneously were on the streets of Madrid, Barcelona, Rome, London, New York, everywhere. And it was a mass kind of demonstration of some kind. And then it disappeared, and you kind of went, well, what happened to it? Why can't it come back again? But I'm not into the midst of a lot of that. I get on the fringes of some of that, so I see some of that. But it's a very interesting moment in the sense that there is a tremendous amount going on the ground. On the currency thing, New York, there are about 2 or 3 organizations like Timeshare and things like that which are doing things. But they're doing things kind of in their corner, And you want to go a bit further than just doing things in your corner. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question. What are your thoughts on new forms of collective bargaining on the consumption side? And by that I mean, if all the people paying, say, health insurance throughout the country or the world were to go on strike, all the people paying rent in a given city, or all the people paying student loans in a given state were to coordinate and go on strike to negotiate an economy.
Yeah, I think, again, consumer boycotts have not been very effective politically. That's my general kind of feeling. You'd have to do it in some way where you would set up escrow accounts or something of that kind, so that you couldn't be charged as not paying. So I think that there's room on the consumer side to do more. Obviously, there's a big difference between housing. Healthcare, I think, would be very difficult to organise now. What do you think?
Well, I'm wondering if everyone in paid healthcare in the state of New Jersey could join the union, just like you would if you worked at a certain factory.
Yeah. Yeah, the healthcare system is so, the insurance structures are so fragmented, so it's, we know the enemy is the system, but you don't know exactly which office to pick it. That's part of the problem. But I'm not convinced that a lot of energy put into that would be a good idea. But I may be wrong.
I was interested in your thoughts on commodification of ecological goods.
Yeah.
The sense that probably a lot of the left and a lot of liberals would welcome it if the United States were to agree to join a carbon trading market. But to me, there seems some reason to worry about commodifying rights to pollute units of atmosphere, but in this financial sector, then deal with the exchange value of that.
Yeah, well, that's the classic case where that's what Al Gore gave us in lots of ways. I'm a great environmentalist, and we've got to unleash the powers of the market to solve the environmental problem, and that's crazy. Because it's the powers of the market that are creating the environmental problem. The same thing happens with global poverty. I've been around a long time now, and every decade there's somebody who declares there's going to be a war on global poverty, and the way to do it is to unleash the market. And you kind of go, well, the market is what creates global poverty, so what are we talking about here? And the same is true with this. I don't agree with those people on the left who kind of say carbon trading is a good idea. I think it's crazy. Forming a new market for pollution, I don't know, maybe we should just form a new market for so we can sort of bet on the success of the mafia or something. It doesn't make sense to me. That's why I kind of say we should always have in mind, tactically in certain situations you may not be able to do this, but we should always have in mind moving towards the use value side wherever we can. And I think the climate change stuff and carbon emissions and things like that, I think just absolute caps on emissions is precisely where you should go, not this business of creating a market, which has become speculative. And so futures and carbon trading are big business, and people are making fortunes out of it, particularly in Europe. I find that thoroughly objectionable.
I guess I'm interested, something I've been very interested in recently has been the idea of the possibility that internet-based structures, large-scale social networks, companies like Google, could possibly, like the way you spoke about the state as a coercive apparatus that complements capital or is the kind of necessary but also denying or the contradictory other to the exchange value of something. I see entities like Google and Facebook taking over the state in a lot of ways, or over time to take over the state in its role as this coercive apparatus that reinforces the system of private property. And I say that also because J.D. Wales, the Wikipedia founder, and all those guys are kind of intense libertarians. And I guess I was just wondering if you see, despite all its liberating aspects, like the ways in which the internet could come to, or not the internet, I feel like it's a bad way to say it, social networks could come to replace the state, or if you see that as a possible trend in the continuation of capital itself as a system.
I mean, seems to me there's an interesting struggle evolving over traditional forms of state power and the kind of powers that are now wielded by Google and Amazon and groups like that. I mean, you look at something like cloud computing. If you control the cloud, then yeah, people can use it, but it's always it's always possible for whoever controls it to discipline it in certain ways. So some of the really radical people I know are kind of saying you've got to create your own platform. That's the only way to go, and that's a lot of work, and that's very hard. And as soon as you get into it, if you're likely to get into a lot of dirty tricks coming your way. Your system gets interfered with and all the rest of it. So there's a very, I think, the monopoly power. But you see, the interesting thing here is it's rather analogous to the way in which the merchant bankers in London allied eventually with the state apparatus to create a monopoly structure which was about protecting their very particular kinds of oligarchical interests. And I can see that a deal sort of being struck between the state apparatus and Google, etc., which would do exactly the same kind of thing. It's over information, not about money. So I would be very, very concerned about that. And I don't think, people like to make a lot of the liberatory possibilities that exist in social networks, and I think at one level that's true, but at another level it's totally controllable by these forces. I mean, it's a very different world, it seems to me, right now, emerging out of that, and it is about monopoly control, not about ultimate liberty of these things.
Just I'm thinking about like the reduction of inheritance recently through debt and like increased medical expenses and stuff like that, and trying to figure out if what sort of recuperative phase that fits in, if that's just like an enclosure of commonwealth or like pulling back the private property. I'm thinking primarily in like inheriting of houses that was given as a result of after World War II, or if that's rational consumption I haven't thought about before.
I'm not quite sure what the question is.
It's not necessarily like a question. I'm just thinking about like it feels like that one form of wealth has existed throughout in different ways is like inheritance from one generation to the other, and with the increase in like medical costs and loans and stuff, even that type of potential resources.
Well, but I think also what's happening. I mean, I didn't really talk about it, but a lot of what's been going on is this kind of politics of accumulation by dispossession. And if you look at the dispossession of people's pension rights, you look at the dispossession that's occurred in terms of healthcare. I flew American Airlines to Buenos Aires back in December, and very interesting. I had a whole lecture from the hostess about American Airlines has declared bankruptcy, and one of the ways they can out of bankruptcy is to renege on all their pensions, and she'd been working for American Airlines for 15 years, and essentially was now being dispossessed of her pension rights. So that American Airlines could come out of bankruptcy and start flying again as a lean and mean airline with no obligations to the people who work there in terms of pension rights or healthcare. I mean, that's a dispossession. And in the same way there's been dispossession in the foreclosure movement and housing and all the rest of it, there's an economy of dispossession which has been very, very strong out there. And of course, the loss of housing values in certain parts of the country have been very, very significant. So yeah, there are losses of that kind which are being incurred, but notice who's incurring them. And at the same time, you have all of these losses going on in, say, in African Americans losing all asset values. Wall Street, they're paying themselves $40 billion in bonuses. Now, I can't prove that the money that the African Americans lost is the money that ended up in the Wall Street pockets, but when this group over here loses 40 million and this group over here gains 40 million, you've got to say, hey, there's something in this system which when the affluent have got even more, and vulnerable communities suffered serious losses. I mean, this is the dynamics of the situation, and I think there's the system right now, the oligarchy is ruthless. I mean, it'll prey on old people, it'll prey on whoever. Doesn't care.
I have a question that relates to the beginning. You discussed the shortcomings of mapping. And I'm wondering, is there a possible way of creating a cartography of the contradictions of capitalism we've seen? What would be the most effective visual displays of the contradictions between the use and
I'd love for you to come up with one, yeah. I've been playing actually with the way they interlock with each other, you know. I mean, it's very interesting. They're not independent of each other, and I think this is Marx's notion of the idea there's a totality there of interlocking contradictions. And they feed off each other. And in certain situations, they sort of counteract each other, and so they stabilize. But then the interesting question is what happens when you start to get, you know, the equivalent of a runaway thing through a tightly coupled system.
And then would that unleash undo the entire system?
Yes.
Right. And can that be mapped?
Yes. Yeah. No, I'd love to come up with some visuals for that, but my magic marker skills are not very strong. So I need to find the guy who did the cartoon version of one of my talks and magic marker skills. Sorry, you mind. There's one here.
Yes, and she.
Oh, good.
So you talked at the beginning about how it's possible for capitalism to be more egalitarian. And I'm wondering, given where we are in this country, do you think it makes sense or it's wise to think of more egalitarian capitalism as a short-term or medium-term goal on the way to envisioning a larger shift, or is that just a distraction from having true equality?
Well, I go up and down on that. I mean, there are certain times when it seems to me the only thing you can really hope for is just to make the system a bit more egalitarian and just make the system a bit more environmentally friendly and all the rest of it. In other words, move incrementally and try and get a 5% improvement here and a 3% improvement there. And then at some point or other, I think, what's the point? Why don't we just sort of blow the whole thing up and do a kind of complete rejigging? So I shift a little bit. I'm not
there is a category that I do like, which is the idea of revolutionary reforms. That is, beginning with something like a reform, what looks like a purely reformist agenda, but which, when you really push it, starts to actually create deep stresses within the system as a whole. And to the degree that I think there's a great deal of public support for a more egalitarian kind of society right now, I kind of tend to say, yeah, let's push that one, because I think that, you know, the capital accumulation process could probably benefit from increasing egalitarianism right now. In other words, it would help stabilize the system. The problem is, if it stabilized the system, it wouldn't necessarily stabilize the position of the oligarchy that controls it. So the oligarchy that controls it is actually in favor of policies which actually further destabilize the system. So now, if you can get people to understand that, then you move to a situation where you start to become more egalitarian, and I think that that's one of the ways of dismantling oligarchic power, or challenging oligarchic power. And we see a path towards then you know, sort of a more radical transformation. So I think you would pick and choose which you would do in terms of would you want to reform this, or would you want to be more radical about it. I think on the egalitarian topic, I would tend to say, yeah, let's push all we can towards a much more egalitarian structure. To begin with, people would have more resources to start to do other things, and actually revolutions often occur at a point of rising incomes, not of falling incomes. And so I think I'd be in favor of pursuing that one as potentially having a reform which has potential revolutionary implications.
In your talk, you mentioned the state, obviously, and then you talked about alternative institutions that behave like a state. And at the end of your talk, you said, described imagining a different kind of society. And I'm just kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit about the unit of analysis of society and how that maps out. Do you see the nation state as what do you think about the nation state and about global imagining of when you describe revolutions, etc.?
Well, I tend to look on these issues from the standpoint of what I call nested hierarchies of institutions. And I know it's not very popular on the left to talk about hierarchies, but I don't see how you can do without it. And when I say a nested hierarchy, I think of collective production and consumption, consumer units of some kind that would be nested in, say, a bioregional form of organization, that would be nested in a much larger trading complex, which would be nested in some institutions of global regulation and governance. Something of that sort. I mean, I would think the scales could be changed, but I think you always have to recognize that institutional arrangements have to be designed at different scales to deal with different kinds of problems. The question of global warming is very difficult to deal with simply at the local scale, even though the politics that you might need should have local implications. But at some point or other, you need somebody to be able to tell you there's a global ozone hole or there's global warming going on, which means you need institutions which are looking out for global problems of that sort, and also institutions which would have at least suggestions as to what to do about it. But similarly, there are bioregional configurations where I would be in favor of trying to create metropolitan bioregional configurations which are not self-subsistent, but which are self-sufficient to as big a degree as they possibly can. I don't think bringing water from Fiji and France makes sense to me. So we could do far better than that in terms of use of our energy resources and the like.
Question? John?
I would like to ask you to kind of return to the distinction you made at the outset between capital and capitalism. Because it occurs to me that to think about capital without capitalism runs the risk of abstracting and dehistoricizing the emergence of abstraction and contradictions which characterize capital and which occur precisely through the logics, in and through the logic of racialization and gender formation. And again, the reason I'm asking about that is because it seems we're at a risk of marginalizing some of the contributions that critical race theory might make, and feminist theory, and also the politics associated with those formations. The politics that from those formations might make a contribution to an anti-capitalist struggle for social justice.
I'm all in favour of all of that being fully integrated into an anti-capitalist struggle. I'm just trying to identify the specific contradictions which exist within the logic of capital accumulation. That's all I'm trying to do. It doesn't diminish anything that other people do in the areas they work on.
So doesn't it render race and gender phenomenal? Doesn't thinking in that mode render race and gender phenomenal?
No, of course not. Of course not. Because in the end, we're interested in the reconfiguration of a capitalist society. But you can't reconfigure a capitalist society without reconfiguring capital. I'm interested in what reconfigurations of capital would be required as necessary to reconfigure a capitalist society. That's what I'm interested in. And that doesn't say I'm ignoring all those other struggles. I've worked with those, and I'm very happy to do so. But it doesn't matter where you're at. Of course, you're all going to use abstractions, if I wanted, if we really got into a fight in this, I complain that one of the things that anti-race folk don't get is what the nature of capital is. Okay, and in exactly the same way, you can say, isn't there a risk of you being, whatever word you use, epiphenomenal or something? I think there's a serious risk of envisaging, say, certain kind of struggles against racialization, envisaging those struggles as if they are not located in a society which is dominated by the circulation and accumulation of capital. And I don't see the structure of contradictions. I can't find a purely racial, gendered explanation of where the housing crisis came from. I can't. Nor can I find a racial, gendered explanation of why financialization took off in the way it did. I can't find those explanations. Those are the kinds of things I want to explain. Now, the impacts, of course, of the housing crisis on race and gender were huge. And the way they got racialized and the way they got gendered is a very, very serious kind of question. And political organization has to take that into account. But that's what I mean by trying to, what does an analysis try to do? It's like you try to isolate a certain kind of part of a much bigger totality, i.e. capitalism. You try to isolate a part of it and bring it into, and show what its rules are and recognize it's embedded in all of that, but at the same time it has its own logic. And I think that's what I get from the race literature, what I get from the gender literature, is an understanding of those questions, which are absolutely essential for understanding what a revolutionary reconfiguration of capitalism would look like. But unless you know and have a very clear understanding of the dynamics of accumulation and circulation, and what the contradictory character of that is, and what the nature of money has to be. This is a crucial thing. What the nature of money has to be to support this system. Until you understand certain of those things, then you're not going to understand those things which will be absolutely necessary for a full reconfiguration of capitalism to take place. Otherwise, you end up being in the situation, as is happening for some of the recuperating factories in Argentina and elsewhere. I'm all in favour of worker control, this kind of thing, but they're embedded in this broader structure I'm talking about, and to the degree they're embedded in it, they find themselves at some time or other forced to connive at their own self-exploitation within this structure. So part of the politics here is to say, look, I'm all in favour of worker control, and I support the movements of recuperating factories. The more the better. Let's go. Now, how are you going to coordinate all your activities in such a way that you can actually start to gain some sort of permanence and some sort of real configuration? And I think it's interesting to note that the one cooperative that's really lasted this long has been Mondragon, and the reason Mondragon has survived among many others is that not only is it about production, but it's about commerce, so it controls commodity circuit of capital, it also controls the financial circuit of capital because it sets up its own financial institutions. So when you kind of say, look, Mondragon survived because it did this, so the recuperated factories have to start to set up your own credit unions, your own credit structures. And you also have to set up your own marketing structures and your own, In other words, those are the kinds of things that you can start to derive from these broader kinds of areas, from the very specific kinds of analysis of the nature of what capital is about. Otherwise, you can end up fighting for something and find yourself just completely surrounded by these other elements. And the recuperated factories, and they're surrounded by the banks, and they're surrounded by the equivalent of Walmart and all the rest of it, they don't stand much chance of really realizing their potentiality and their mission. And I feel about the same in relationship to kind of questions of race and gender and all the rest of it. Because again, the dynamics of that have been very, very significant, I think, particularly in recent times.
Can I just follow up on this phrasing gender thing? When you were talking earlier, it seemed to me that I know that in the 90s, gay and lesbian people were marketed to in a very specific way that they weren't prior to that time. And the desire for inclusion and self-reflection ended up to be a kind of critical fault swap of its own. It's an abstract commodity, and it has to do with the relationship between the individual and the group. I think that there's somewhere in your contradictions are these contradictions that are social, emotional to start with, in terms of wanting to be represented and allowing either the government or the thing like marriage or the economy, I can participate in buying too. It seems really inherent in these things that you're saying. I don't really know how, but there's a missing link between capitalism as a whole and then these contradictory parts that have to do with the affect of inclusion and wanting to participate in that way.
Yeah, one of the manageable contradictions is precisely trying to address the question you're raising, which is about the relationship between capital accumulation and identity and household and all that kind of thing. So that's I don't know, I've forgotten which number it is. It's about contradiction 12 or something like that. No, I mean, I think that is a very interesting kind of point of intersection, where I think I'm going to have an interesting time when I get to try and write about that one. It's in there in the list.
I want to say, or ask a question in relationship to what everybody's saying recently, is that capitalism survives by creating the market. So we have these divisions of race, gender, ethnicity. The housing market can move to single parent families, women to be able to buy houses, and then move the house and that's the division. So in what you're describing of moving forward with the credit union, capitalism can also take over those processes. And it loves those kinds of markets. And part of Marx's idea is that where profit is made, or where money is really made, is from labor. So if we have these labor unions forming and coming together to decide what they're going to work for, what they want, and they're making these new vehicles, capitalism just can come in and incorporate those into the whole system.
Yeah, there's only one thing worse than being co-opted, and that's not being co-opted. And capital is very, very sophisticated in the way in which it responds to many of these trends. I mean, look at how sophisticated it's been on the multiculturalism question. Wonderful new markets evolve out of that. I think, it can take almost anything like that and utilize it. So yeah. But there are, as I mentioned, certain contradictions that it cannot easily overcome. And so part of my concern here would be to try to identify what I think are the leading contradictions within the circulation and accumulation of capital, which is only a minor part of what capitalism is about, but a very important minor part. And to use that knowledge and understanding to try to unpack a little bit the whole kind of issue of where co-optations are likely to come from and why they're likely to come in the way they do and what the impacts are. For instance, mentioned, I take the view that suburbanization was one of the great ways in which the United States came out of the Great Depression in the 1930s, where you think of all of the social, political, affective consequences of a suburbanized lifestyle, and all that was involved in that, and you see capitalism creating and co-opting the suburbanization process and actually pushing it even further and harder, because this was a great way to use accumulated surpluses and a great way to actually fulfill the mission of compound growth. But you can see how a suburban solution has run out of possibility and run out of room, except of course in China. If you go to China, you see the most horrible suburbanization going on. It's kind of almost like a caricature of the United States. So you've got those dynamics are the ones that I'm really interested in trying to unpack by analyses of this sort.
Thanks, David.
Going back, or are we done? Okay.
pick up also.